Good afternoon from Toronto. This is the third paper of the third day of the Kalecki conference. Our speaker today is Marc Lavoie. And to introduce our chair, Marcine, one of the co-organizers of the conference, will introduce her and she will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis-Philippe. So the chair of the next session is Maria Cristina Barbieri-Goes. She's a PhD candidate in political economy at Roma Tre University. In her dissertation, she focused on the role of distribution as well as monetary and fiscal policy for economic growth. She was first inspired to study distribution and growth while reading Kalecki's theory of economic dynamics during her undergraduate years at Unicamp, University of Campinas, Brazil, which is also my university. She holds a master from the University Sorbonne Paris Cité and the Berlin School of Economics and Law. Maria Cristina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin, for the very nice introduction. So as Louis-Philippe has mentioned, you will keep mute during this presentation and we'll leave questions for the end of the presentation. We have 90 minutes. I will let you know if you can ask your question in the end of Marc's presentation. You can either raise your hand, which is the blue hand there in the participants box, or write it, type it down, and I can read it for you. So I'm very glad to introduce Marc's presentation today because I was one of his last students in Paris. So needless to say, he has recently ended this 3-year position at the Senior Research Chair from the University Sorbonne Paris Cité. He's now emeritus professor at the University Paris 13 and emeritus professor from the University of Ottawa, where he taught for 37 years. He's a research fellow at the Macroeconomic Research Institute of the Hans Volcker Foundation in Düsseldorf and research associate of the Brown Band Institute in Toronto. Lavoie has published 10 books and over 150 refereed articles and 80 book chapters, mostly in macroeconomics, monetary economics, and growth theory, but also in other fields such as economics of sports. I don't know if any of you know, but he has been also in the Olympic Games. He's best known for his book with Godley, Monetary Economics, published in 2007, which is considered a must-read from users of stock flow consistent approach. His latest book, Post-Keynesian Economics, New Foundations, received the 2007 Murdoch Prize from the European Association of Evolutionary Political Economy. And he's co-editor of 2 academic journals and is on the editorial board of 10 other journals. I'm very glad to introduce you all to Marc Lavoie's presentation. Marc, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria Cristina. It's good to see you after a few years in Paris. So can you hear me well, or Louis-Philippe? Yeah, okay. So I'll try to go now to the split image. Do you get the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes. How do I get it properly now? Mode lecture. Okay. Right. Well, as Amitava said, I think it was yesterday, there is a new fashion in neo-Kaleckian models, which is the models dealing with autonomous non-capacity creating expenditures, which are considered to be exogenously given in those Kaleckian models. So this is what I'll be dealing with. but the focus of this variant of the neo-Kaleckian model will be on overhead labor costs, taking into account overhead labor costs. So why do we worry about overhead labor cost? Robert Blecker yesterday as well explained that you could find them in the first Kaleckian models, those of the first generation with Harris and Ezimakopoulos. But also, as I say here, since the work of Piketty, the issue of income distribution within the wage earners has attracted a lot of attention. Whereas before, in PK, authors didn't pay too much attention except for a few people. So there is this widening gap between managers on the one hand, and on the other hand, ordinary workers, or what I call direct workers, or blue-collar workers, or non-supervisory workers. I believe that, so that's my personal opinion, that taking into account overhead labor helps to assess the empirical controversies about whether economies are wage-led or profit-led from a demand side. And I believe also that the existence of overhead labor sets a bias in the results on the empirical work done on this topic. Now, this is a conference about Kalecki, not only about Kaleckians. So Kalecki had 3 categories. I discovered this more recently by looking at this 1939 book that was republished by Professor Osiatensky. So Kalecki had 3 categories, of course, the capitalist on the one hand, but also the managers who earn salaries and the manual workers or the clerks who did not save in that Kalecki. So this will resemble very much what I will be doing. And Kalecki, in the book that most of us know best, the one that was published by Cambridge University Press in 1971, assumed that aggregate production and profit per unit of output rise or fall together. And this results, at least to some extent, from the fact that a part of the wages are overheads. And this is what will be found in the model. And a bit later, he added salaries, because of their overhead character, are likely to fall less during the depression and to rise less during the boom than wages. So the model that will be built, and in fact that owes a lot to Robert Rothorn's presentation of the Kaleckian model back in 1981, will incorporate exactly this feature. There's also a link with Steindl, who worked for a while with Kalecki and who was a big fan of Kalecki. So he said in his 1952, changes in the gross profit margin may be explained by changes in overhead costs per unit at given degrees of capacity utilization. An increase in overhead costs might, for example, appear in the form of greater payroll for salaries. And then another statement from Kalecki, which will be incorporated in the model to be presented, is other factors must be considered. The influence of changes in the level of overheads in relation to prime costs upon the degree of competition. So what he's saying is that if there is an increase in the level of overheads, this may have an impact on the markup and therefore on the price level. One thing I forgot to say from the very beginning is that this article has been presented and written with my colleague, South Korean colleague, Woon Jun Na, who has been quite active in South Korea in promoting the idea of wage-led economy or income-led economy, which at least for a while has been pursued by such policy of wage-led growth being pursued by the South Korean government for a few years. And continuing with the link with Steindl, he pointed out, and I think it's something which too often is forgotten, that the net profit margin can in fact change for two quite different reasons, either because of a change in the rate of utilization of capacity with an otherwise unchanged structure of costs and prices, or the net profit margin can change at a given level of capacity. And this will happen if the gross profit margins change. So I think this is also related to the interchange that was done between Amit Batouri and Amitava Dutt this morning. After, mainly, well, during Batouri's presentation and after his presentation. Here I have some data that is based on that Mohun used in a paper that was published in 2014, and he provided us and a former student of mine with this data. And so you can see that, well, on the left, you have the non-supervisory workers, and on the right, you have the supervisory workers. So the way they are split, here you have the number of millions of individuals who are non-supervisory workers, and here the number of people we can consider as supervisory. Whoops. Here you have the total wages which are being distributed to the non-supervisory workers, and here the supervisory workers. And so you can see that despite being less numerous, the supervisory workers, of course, earn almost as much as in total as the non-supervisory workers. When you look at the annual wage rate, the non-supervisory workers get this amount here, more like $40,000 a year. With the supervisory workers, it's about 4 times more. So as I say here, as of 2010, while overhead workers represent less than 20% of all workers, their annual salary is over 4 times that of ordinary workers. Whereas back in 1964, that's the earliest data that Mohun had, the annual salary of the overhead workers or supervisory workers was only about 2.3 times that of ordinary workers. So indeed, as Piketty has emphasized, the discrepancy in wages earned by the two kinds of workers has quite increased. So how do we model this? Well, we have a standard neo-Kaleckian model of growth and distribution, but with no inventories, where we assume that there is enough time for supply to adjust to demand. There is this distinction that I mentioned. I will be assuming that direct labor does not save, whereas overhead labor saves and hence receives both salaries and dividends on their savings. So one could say that the managers are at the same time the capitalists. Prices are set on the basis of normal cost pricing, and more precisely, they will be based on target return pricing. So I will explain what precisely this means. And then, as pointed out at the beginning, there is an autonomously growing consumption expenditure that does not by itself create production capacity. And this means that the average propensity to save is endogenous, despite the fact that the marginal propensities to save out of salaries and profit are constant. And of course, the propensity to save out of wages, as I said, is zero. So there's two strands in the literature that splits workers into managers and ordinary direct workers. So one strand has managers as another kind of direct labor. So there's a number of people, Amitav Adot, Tom Pally in a couple of articles, and more recently, Ederer and Rem in 2020, who have dealt with managers in this way. In the case of Ederer and Rem, sometimes it's sophisticated because they take into account the fact that capitalists may save, but also the managers. And then there is this other way, which personally I prefer, which is that managers are an overhead cost. So in the short run, if you want, despite fluctuations in production, the number of overhead labor will be fixed. And this was the approach taken by Azimakopoulos, Harris, Rothorn, who inspired me quite a lot, but also Heinz Kurz in a paper that was published in 1990 and 1991. Nichols and Norton, and myself, I've insisted a lot on this, especially with my book in 1992. And Nikiforos. Okay. So there's a number of people who believe that a growth model with autonomously growing expenditures may be an appropriate way to model basic stylized facts of modern economies with access to credit. So in particular, I refer you to a paper by Brett Fiebiger, a former postdoc of ours here at the University of Ottawa. And in a way, I would argue that this new formulation is closer to most of the empirical studies which have been made, because what this new formulation assesses are level effects of changes in income distribution, whereas in the standard neo-Kaleckian model, there would be a growth rate effect of a change in the share of wages or in the share of profits. So this new formulation, one can say, arises from the so-called super multipliers Rafnan models of Freitas and Serrano, or Serrano and Freitas. And a Kaleckian version of those super multipliers Rafnan models, where you have this autonomous growing expenditures, was first found in a paper of Olivier Alain. He has had another one in 2019, trying to take into account how this could be linked to the rate of growth of population and technical progress. And all these authors that you see there, Dutt, Hein, Fadzari, and his colleagues, myself, Pariboni, and my co-author, Wunjun Na, and myself, we have had 3 previously published papers on this topic. So Amitava may say, oh, we are just doing variations of the same model. Okay, so here is the outline of the presentation after this long introduction. So I'll be presenting the model with its basic equations. So the pricing equations, which will play an important role. We'll be able to identify the income shares. We'll give a look at the saving and investment equations. Then we will look at the short run equilibrium. What happens if there is a change in the wage premium to the managers? If you want, the discrepancy between the salary rate that the managers get with compared to the wage rate that the direct labor gets. Then we can also look at the short run equilibrium when there is a change in the target rate of return. We'll look at what happens in the long run equilibrium when all the variables become endogenous, except of course the rate of growth of these exogenous consumer expenditures. And then a few concluding remarks. Okay, so first, what we specifically assume is that the number of direct workers is a direct function of the level of output, whereas the number of workers here called fixed workers, so those are the overhead workers, they depend not on the level of output Q, but on the full capacity output, QFC. So when you take a ratio between those, well, YD would be, in a sense, the direct labor productivity. When you take a ratio of these two measures, we call it F, and that measures the size of overhead workers relative to direct workers when the economy is at full capacity. Now, what about the pricing? Well, in a number of papers, I've claimed that, well, perhaps the best way to see pricing is to have target return pricing, which means that the price is such that the normal rate of profit, which will be the target rate of return, will be achieved when the economy is running at the normal rate of utilization of capacity. So we'll have sigma will be the wage premium for managers, which, as I said before, is roughly equal to 4 in the United States. Rn is the normal profit rate or the target rate of return. Un is the normal rate of utilization. And V is an assumed exogenous capacity to full capacity ratio. So we will not really be looking at what happens to V. So when you play around with this target return pricing, what you get is that the price will depend on W over YD, which is the direct labor unit cost. The direct unit labor cost is then modified by the fact that you have to add the overhead labor cost. And then this part here is 1 plus the markup. So the markup is this expression here. So you can play around, and in the end, you can express the price directly as a function of the unit labor direct cost multiplied by 1 plus the percentage markup. And in the end, it gives you this expression here, which is relatively simplified. And then from there, you can compute the income shares, the income share of direct labor, which we will call D, the income share of the managers, which we will call M, and the profit share, pi. The profit share being the net profit share once we have paid direct labor and the overhead labor. And what we get here is, of course, the income share of direct labor is a negative function of sigma. So the more, the higher the wage premium, the smaller the income share of direct labor. You can see also, right, okay, so this is what we can say. When we look at the income share of managers, it is inversely related to economic activity, because when you compute it, you find that it's an inverse function of U. And what about the profit share? Well, the profit share is 1 minus the share of direct labor minus the share of overhead labor. And again, this time you see the inverse. You can see that the profit share is directly related to the level of economic activity U, because we have U in the denominator and there is a negative sign in front of it. So in the end, there is a positive relationship between the rate of utilization and the profit share. So my point is that if you do some econometric exercises, I think that you are likely to find a bias in favor of a profit-led demand economy because of this straightforward, almost definitional relationship. So this is what this says. An expansion in effective demand brings about changes in the composition of labor. The share of profits tends to increase with the rate of capacity utilization. Even if there is no change in the target rate of return. In the presence of overhead labor, the traditional profit share will not succeed in isolating the pure effects of profitability on accumulation, in contrast to what is argued in most empirical studies. I've argued about this in detail in a paper that was published in the European Journal of Economics and Economic Policies recently, but you can find the same argument in a very well-known paper by Weisskopf that was published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics in 1979, and Sherman and Evans in their textbook in 1984 also make this point in great detail in their book. So this is what I was saying. In my view, empirical research will be biased in finding a profit-led demand regime. And it seems to me that we should ask the question, can the share of profits still be considered to be a good indicator of expected profitability or the relative bargaining position of capital? And my answer is, in general, well, not really. Okay, so Weisskopf did compute a corrected income share. So this is what he did in 1979. So the corrected income share, profit share, sorry, is 1 minus the share of direct labor minus M, which is the share of the managers or overhead labor. Well, that's our version, in fact. Multiplied by Q divided by the full capacity output. And if you do that with target return pricing, in the end, what you find is that the corrected profit share should, in fact, be equal to this expression. The target rate of return or the normal rate of profit multiplied by the capital to capacity ratio divided by the normal rate of utilization of capacity. So that the corrected profit share does not depend anymore on the actual rate of utilization capacity, but depends on the normal rate of capacity, which we assume to be exogenous. Okay, so this was the target return pricing component. With respect to, usually Kaleckian models are usually based on three equations. There is a pricing equation, so to speak. There is a saving equation and an investment equation. So when we look at the saving equation, the way we have set it up is that we assume there are three components. There is saving from firms, so that's the first component, which says that there is a retained earnings ratio, which is SF, F for the, so to speak, the saving propensity of the firms. And then there's a propensity to save by households. And as I said, the only household to save are the managers who receive, well, MQ is their share of income, and they receive the dividends out of the profits. So it's the second term here. So the term between brackets, square brackets, is the income received by the managers. Minus Z, so there is this saving, which is due to the autonomous consumption by the managers. And then we can write the saving function in growth terms. So the capital Z here, which represented an absolute value, becomes small z, which is then the autonomous consumption of the managers divided by the value of capital. And when we do all the substitutions, then we get something which is a little bit more complicated. But we still have the Z, which is here. And the investment function, well, as was discussed several times today and yesterday, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the investment function should look like. So here we took the investment, the simplest investment function, which simply says that investment depends on gamma, which is some sort of long-term expected rate of growth of sales, and that it depends on the discrepancy between the actual rate of utilization and the normal rate of utilization. And of course, sales will be equal to production when these two rates are equal. And the adjustment will be essentially done by the rate of capacity utilization. Okay, so now we look at the short run. So what do we mean by the short run? We mean that these three variables are constant: productive capacity, the expectation of the firms about future sales growth, which was the gamma variable in the investment equation, and the autonomous consumption of managers in absolute value will also be constant in the short run. Let's deal first with what happens if there is an increase in the wage premium to managers, which we can argue that this is what has been happening over the last 20 or 30 years. So if there is such an increase in the parameter sigma, in the relative wage, if you want, of overhead labor, there will be a positive effect, redistribution of income to the managers away from the retained earnings of the firms. But there will also be a negative effect in the sense that there will be a redistribution of income to the managers away from direct labor. The reason being this target return pricing formula, because if there is an increase in overhead labor costs, this will induce the firms to raise the, this will lead to a rise in the unit cost and therefore a rise in the price, and therefore the share of direct labor will be smaller. And as one would expect, the higher the propensity to save of the managers and the lower is the retention ratio of firms, the more likely will this change reduce aggregate demand. So there's a positive effect, there's a negative effect. So the effects, at least in the short run, are uncertain. What happens to the profit curve? So it's called here pi s. From the cost side, we will look at what happens to the profit curve. So the relationship between the profit share and the rate of utilization. We will look at what happens from the demand side later. But so here, if I have a higher wage premium for the overhead labor, what happens is that my profit curve seen from the cost side will rotate up when the rate of utilization is higher than the normal rate, and down when the rate of utilization is smaller than the normal rate. So, you know, right away you can see that this will create complications. From the demand side, well, we have to take into account two cases because looking at the profit share seen from the demand side, we get this expression here with the rate of utilization, the actual rate being here on the right-hand side. I hope you can all see my the arrow. Can you? Yeah, okay. So what happens to the shape of the curve will in fact depends on the sign of the denominator and the sign of the numerator. The sign of the denominator is always positive. The sign of the numerator, well, is not obvious. It could be negative or it could be positive. So usually in most models, we assume that it is, the sign is positive. So this means, because u is in the denominators, means that the curve is downward sloping. But it could also be upward sloping. So again, it creates a bit of a problem. And what are the short run effects of an increase in sigma? Well, in the wage premium, well, most of the time it will be negative. As you can see, there are three cases, and two of them, there are 6 cases, 4 of the 6 are negative. But provided the rate of utilization is around the normal rate or higher than the normal rate, then increasing the wage premium will have a negative effect on the rate of utilization of capacity. But it can also have a positive effect. And what is the effect on the share of profits? Well, usually it's negative, but it could be positive. As I said, this is because there are many, the curves can move in a different way. So this is a little bit complicated. Okay, well, what if we are in the standard case where this term here is positive as is usually assumed? In this, well, this describes, for instance, the case where we would be moving from E0 to E1, so that my profit share would indeed go down and the rate of utilization would go down. So this is what most people would expect. But if we have a very low rate of capacity utilization, and if we are, for instance, in this negative case, then we would be moving from E0 to E1. So in this case, there would be a positive move in the rate of utilization and a possible positive move as well in the profit share. So things can be quite complicated. What if there is an increase in the target? So now we move on to the second question, which is what happens if there is an increase in the target rate of return on economic activity? What we see is that this model is wage-led. And this is not surprising because of the chosen specification for the investment function. So nothing surprising here. If you increase the target rate of return, it will have a negative effect on the rate of utilization of capacity. Maybe I'll skip this. All I want to say is that whenever there is a change in the normal rate of return or target rate of return or normal rate of profit, the pi S curve seen from the cost side will always shift upward vertically more than does the profit curve seen from the demand side. So a higher target rate of return leads to a higher profit share as expected here. As you can see, we would be moving from E0 to E1. But a higher target rate of return may also generate a lower profit share. So we would be moving from E0 to E1. So again, there is a reduction in the rate of utilization, just as it was the case in the previous figure. But there would be a lower profit share. So the fact that there is a lower profit share associated with a lower rate of utilization does not mean that we are in a profit-led model, because this change in the profit share is in fact due to a higher normal rate of profit or higher target rate of return. So if there is a higher target rate of return, one may say, well, it's because the firms have more power relative to trade unions, and that's why they could increase this target rate of return. But it would be wrong to argue in this case that the economy is profit-led. Okay, what about the long run? What is the long run? Well, it's the time period during which our artificial economy reaches a fully adjusted position. So there are two laws of motion. There is an accounting motion which tells me what happens to Z, which I repeat is equal to the amount of autonomous consumer expenditures by the managers divided by the stock of capital. So it's the difference between the rate of growth of these autonomous expenditures, which we assume all along that they are constant. The rate of growth of these is constant, minus the equilibrium rate of accumulation of the economy. And then we impose a Herodian reaction function where we suppose that expect this kind of long-term, the phone is on. Gamma is the expected long-run rate of growth of sales, secular rate of growth of sales. And we assume that it slowly reacts to the discrepancy between the rate of growth of the economy and this expected rate of growth of sales. Okay, well, the stability condition, we had a short-run standard Keynesian stability condition. So if the short-run stability condition holds, and if my reaction in the previous, whoops, no, that's not what I wanted to do. And that's not either also what I wanted to do. Diaporama. I love these things. Okay. Not. Can you still see something? Yeah. Okay, sorry for this. Right. Okay. So if these two conditions, if the Herodian reaction is not too strong, and if the standard stability condition holds, then we get these equilibrium solutions. Of course, the rate of growth of the economy will be equal to the rate of growth of autonomous will be equal to the rate of growth of autonomous consumption expenditures. The rate of utilization will converge to the normal rate. And this will be the value towards which my Z ratio, so the ratio of autonomous consumption expenditures divided by the stock of capital, it will, this will be its long run solution. Okay, so from there we can compute the long-run equilibrium solutions. We can compute the fully adjusted income distribution values. So we can, well, this would be the share of profits, the share of direct labor, and the share of the managers. Okay. What we find is the wage-led nature of accumulation in the transition dynamics. Well, if we take the derivative of this Z, the long-run equilibrium value of Z, with respect to the target rate of return Rn, we get this expression, which is necessarily positive. So what does that mean? It implies that during the transition following an increase in the target rate of return, the stock of capital, and hence GDP, has grown less fast than the constant rate of growth of autonomous expenditure. Because Z is the amount of consumption expenditures, autonomous consumption expenditures, divided by the stock of capital. So if the Z ratio gets bigger, it means that the stock of capital has grown less fast than autonomous expenditure. So this is indicative of the wage-led nature of growth in the long run, in the restricted sense that the rate of capital accumulation on average gets reduced during the traverse until it reaches a new long-run position after an increase in the normal rate of profit. So this means that the level of output will be lower than it would have been otherwise if firms had not decided to raise the target rate of return. So we can say that the economy is wage-led, but looking only at the impact on the level of output or the level of capital. And there's something similar with respect to an increase in the wage premium of managers. We find that the derivative partial derivative of this Z variable with respect to an increase in the wage premium, we see that it is necessarily positive. So again, we can say that during the transition period from the initial to the final state, the average rate of the accumulation goes down after an increase in the wage differential between supervisory and non-supervisory workers. And what's interesting is that this is always true in the long run, even if it is not true in the short run, because as we saw in the short run, we get an ambiguous result about the impact of an increase in the wage differential in favor, wage premium in favor of overhead labor. But in the long run, the impact is necessarily negative. And what the second derivative is saying is that the more wage distribution is equal, the more wage-led will be the economy. And this has also been claimed by previous researchers. So a few conclusions. According to, well, these four authors, they just wrote a working paper that was distributed to a few of us. They claim that the distributive cycle with profit squeeze distribution and profit-led macroeconomic activity is robust. In conclusion, the Goodwin model in its various incarnations and with various extensions rightfully retains its place as the workhorse model of classical Keynesian macroeconomics. So what I am claiming here is that this model questions these conclusions. In fact, in the present model is more in line with other new empirical work that question this neo-Goodwinian vision based on profits being squeezed by wages and economic activity being led by profits. Robert Blecker yesterday mentioned some work with his former PhD student, Michael Covell. Maybe I'm not going to repeat this, but this first paragraph here exactly reproduces what Robert Blecker explained yesterday. That is, if you suppose that the rate of utilization has a contemporaneous effect on the wage share, which is the assumption embedded in our model, an increase in the wage share is generally found to have a positive effect on the rate of utilization. And okay, whereas the standard way that these aggregative studies are done is that they assume away the contemporaneous effect of a change in the rate of utilization on the wage. So as I said, this is a key feature of our model. And then Lillian Rolim, who used the data provided by Mohun, has also published a paper in 2019. And when you do it the standard way with just one kind of wages and profits, she finds the usual Goodwinian results. But when the wage share is split into supervisory and non-supervisory component, as is done in the model here, a positive shock of the workers' share will lead to a decrease in the supervisor's share and to an increase in capacity utilization. A positive shock on the supervisor's share will lead to a decrease in both the workers' share and in capacity utilization. So these are exactly the results that we get in our model. And then she goes further. She shows that there does not seem to exist a profit squeeze mechanism. No, sorry, there does seem to exist a profit squeeze mechanism, which is the second component of this Goodwinian approach. But in contrast to what is found in these, or claimed in these models, the squeeze is done through the supervisor's remuneration and not through the wages obtained by the non-supervisory workers. It is the increase in the wage income share of managers when the economy is doing well that leads to an eventual fall in the rate of capacity utilization. So when things go well, it's not so much the direct workers who benefit from it, it's the managers. But if you look at the wage share in general, you get the impression that this is a profit squeeze. But the profit squeeze is, at least according to Lillian's results, is due to the increase in the salaries of managers. Okay, so the final slide. The political conclusions implied earlier by the analysis can be reasserted. To raise aggregate demand, governments should pursue wage-led policies and policies that tend to reduce wage dispersion between managerial jobs and new non-supervisory jobs. Thank you. That's the end of it.
Thank you, Marc, for your very interesting presentation. So I think we can open the floor for questions. Here I see in the chat that we have some rather comments from Amitav Dutt and Robert Black. One question actually of clarification from Robert Black, which questions which country is the data for, which I think he refers to Mohan's data. I think it's the US, but you can answer.
Yes, the data is only for the US. Apparently, it's almost impossible to get this kind of data for other countries.
Excuse me, Marc, can you take down your PowerPoint presentation, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
I don't know how, though. Vous êtes en train de partager votre écran. Arrêtez le partage. OK.
Voilà.
Some other remarks from Amitav Dutt and Robert Black. Amitav Dutt says, as far as I remember, I assumed managers as overhead labor in some papers. Not sure I ever assumed they are direct labor. Mentioning the first slides on the literature review, but that's rather Amitav Dutt, you can speak up if you wish. And some reference remarks from Robert Blacker. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I mean, yeah, I see the chat here. Well, maybe Amitava, I mean, as far as I remember, overhead labor was behaving just like direct labor in that paper that I mentioned. So that's the only answer I can give to you, Amitava.
Oh, that wasn't a big comment. Yeah. It was just for your information. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then we have some questions. I think the first one to raise the hand is Ilan. So Ilan, if you wish, you can unmute your microphone.
Hi, Marc. Thank you for exciting presentation. I say exciting because it's also my topic, this dispersion based between white and blue colors in my terms, or overhead labor, production worker. On that, which I have 3 papers. And I relate these issues with market concentration. That's why I would like to ask you, what did you assume regarding the level of competition in your model? It is important because somewhere you set the positive relationship between profit rate and utilization rate. But as Steindal argued, the excess capacity, which is preferred by big firms or the monopoles, is crucial not only regarding the barrier as a barrier to entry, but also it decreases the average cost curve. He says the average cost is lower in case of high equipment with excess capacity than a full capacity with lower equipment. That's why such a relation, positive relation between profit share and capacity utilization does not seem to me convincing, especially when we remember the case, the product differentiation in case of oligopolistic competition, rather than a mass production in case of a competitive markets. Yes, in mass production case, in competitive markets, there is a positive relationship between profit rate and capacity utilization because profits relies on level of production. But in a concentrated market where product differentiation dominates, especially when we think of the consumption preferences of white collars or managers, as they prefer to goods that show them different from that when we think of fashion and so on. And in such a case, because of markups charged on that goods also, this product differentiation case does not help us to analyze or to argue a positive relation between capacity and profit share.
Yeah, well, as Robert, I think it was Robert, in answer to a question put by Louis-Philippe Rochon, I mean, unless you want to have a highly complicated model, you cannot put all the issues within a single model. That's also my belief. I mean, my answer to what you're saying, I think the level of competition is measured to some extent by this target rate of return that I've been talking about, and also by the normal rate of utilization that you may use in your pricing equation. So if perhaps if there is a lower level of competition, perhaps you would accept a higher normal rate of utilization and vice versa. This is what I would answer. So it's one way to include your concern into, I mean, that's the only way I can see how you could include your concern into such a model.
May I just maybe to include in the model two different products as Kalecki suggested, one consumption goods for wage earners, one consumption goods for managers, something like that. And then
yeah, you could do that as well. I mean, you could do many things. You could have three classes. You could have direct workers, you could have the managers who save, and you could have a capitalist class who doesn't work but only gets dividends. But then you have to take into account that the relative wealth of these people will change through time, and therefore you have to take into account the dynamics of their shares of wealth through time. So, you know, everything quickly becomes more complicated.
So I think next one is Eric Benedict.
Thank you. Marc, I greatly enjoyed the presentation. I've been working with some models where I did this supervisory, non-supervisory split, mainly because of the data were constrained, but some political economy questions came up that would have invited a broader look. And I just, so this is again complicating the model, but I just wanted to get your feedback on this. I was looking at the organizational literature and there were two different things. So one of them is this work by Mintzberg, classic work in organization, who argued that there's an operating core, so that's the workers, at the very top, the strategic apex, So that's really the top managers, the middle line managers, and then on either side, the techno structure and the support staff. And looking at distribution, basically the techno structure, the middle line managers, and the support staff, you can mix and match those in order to maintain your production with the operating core, maintain the profits at the strategic apex, but then do things in the middle. So the hollowing out of the middle management that was done, and also the tendency to strip out R&D departments after acquisition, if you don't plan on, if you plan to sell off the assets. So it seemed like this more admittedly more complex organizational view might be of use for some of the political economy issues that have arisen in the past few decades. But I haven't succeeded in working with it.
Well, I hope some of our younger colleagues will do that. I don't think I will.
Fair enough.
So I think Amitavadat had also a hand raised.
Yeah, hi, Mark.
Hi.
I like the model. Interesting. But I want to make two general comments. I think the first one you will agree with, which is that this whole wage-led, profit-led thing, and this has come up many times, is it's really gone too far. People claiming that it's profit-led, wage-led, and I appreciate your saying that how sensitive these econometric results are, in terms of what, whether one allows for overhead labor or not. Okay? So again, we should all try to improve income distribution, reduce the so-called manager premium and the profit share, at least at the high levels it is now, regardless of anything. I should add also that that your investment function, in some sense, also favors wage-led, because there are no profitability effects apart from the capacity utilization level there, because of the investment function you've chosen, which depends only on capitalist consumption in the long run and on capacity utilization in the short run. My second question, and this is, you said something about variations on the theme and this and that. I think the interesting aspect of your paper is to include overhead labor, which affects the Kalecki markup. That is by allowing this normal cost pricing. But I think that maybe it goes too far in saying that these people calculate the normal and change it right away in the short run and so forth. And so I think a more general way of doing it is to recognize that the markup can be affected by the overhead costs of labor. And the final point related to this is I'm still not convinced why every thing must be done in terms of normal capacity utilization, because as you show that in the average interpretation, the results are quite similar to what one would have in a Kaleckian type model, where capacity utilization is in fact endogenous in the long run, but that long run is more an average kind of interpretation rather than some normal rate of growth. So it's in that sense, I think, that this work could have been done using a Kaleckian model instead of all this stuff about managerial consumption and forcing the economy to become the normal rate of capacity utilization, partly which ignores the possibility that investment can depend on other factors. Thank you.
Yes, Amitava. More. You had more than two remarks, I think. um, in a sense, you seem to agree with Peter Scott because he seems to be saying, well, who cares whether the economy is wage-led or profit-led? If we want to change income distribution in favor of wages or in favor of less inequality in wages, then we should argue in favor of this for ethical reasons rather than strictly speaking economic reasons.
No, I don't agree with Peter, but that's another
No, I know
issue.
you don't. I was teasing you. About the investment function, yeah, I made a small remark at some point saying, well, the results are not surprising because my investment function is the standard Kaleckian investment function, which almost always gives you wage-led results unless you suppose there is also saving by the direct workers or the workers. About your remark on what should we say about the markup or the pricing equation, you seem to be arguing that, okay, we should be saying, like Kalecki, that if there are overheads, then perhaps firms will take that into consideration when setting higher prices. Okay, but so I just think that you get more precise results if you assume target return pricing. So that you can say something very clear, in particular.
Yeah, but it could be precisely wrong.
Yeah, of course you can be precisely wrong. We know that. But at least you get, for instance, this interesting result with regards to the profit share seen from the cost side, where if you change the wage premium, well, it may have a certain impact if the rate of utilization is greater than the normal rate, and a different impact if it is lower than, you get something precise under the assumed conditions. And with respect to normal utilization, well, it plays a role only when we're looking at the long run equilibrium. But most of the, say hello to your wife, but she just, but I mean, most of the action in the model, if you want, is in the short run. And in the short run, we don't assume that the economy is converging towards the normal rate of utilization.
Well, with
we only,
that,
sorry, we only do in the long run.
Okay, so I think next one on our list is Jerry Corvizanos. I remind you that we have 15 minutes more of session, so I think we have 2 or 3 more questions. Go ahead, Jerry.
Thank you. Hi, Mark.
Hi.
I'm not going to complicate your model. I'm actually more asking implications, one, and more a political economy question. In my presentation, I was skeptical about wage-led policies in the real world, but I was very interested that you said that your colleague, who your co-author in South Korea, they're pursuing wage-led policies. Given the civil rights nature of a lot of South Asian economies that are very much civil liberties are very low on the agenda, I'm surprised at government going from towards a wage-led policies. And I'm wondering whether this is indicative of many countries in the world, because I don't see wage-led policies as being, certainly not in the Anglo-speaking world do I ever see that. I'm not sure where anybody else is interested in wage-led policies. The second question, and this is really with the Australian data, workers, and this is non-managers and non-salary, your workers. In Australia, the data shows that they are now saving. They've got huge amount of debt, and they're paying off only the interest, particularly on homes. And the more insecurity with COVID and so on, the more they're saving, and they're not actually doing what Kalecki says. How does that if you change that in your model, how would that change the conclusions, if at all?
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Well, with regards to wage-led policies, in South Korea, they called it income-led policies, so that it would look a little bit broader. It came, in fact, for some reason, the South Korean government decided to follow the recommendation of an ILO report, and also following a book that I wrote with Engelbert Stockhammer. Well, we were the editor of the book, and we had the first chapter in that book. And as far as I know, the policy has been more or less given up now, and was under heavy criticism because simultaneously as this was put in place, things did not go well in South Korea. So I'm not sure about the future of this. You were wondering whether there were any wage-led policies in the rest of the world. Well, in North America, there is a big movement in favor of at least raising the minimum wage. You know, this $15 an hour wage, a minimum wage, both in many states in the United States and in several provinces in Canada also, there is this push. So I don't know. Maybe it will go forward one day after the COVID. With respect to the present crisis, I am just as puzzled as many other people about how to model the COVID-19 crisis. In Canada, the saving rate of household out of disposable income used to be 3 or 4%. Over from April to June, the second quarter of the year, it was 28%.
Yeah, same in Australia. Yeah,
same in the US as well. So I mean, obviously the reason is that people, well, first they may order some consumer goods, but they can't get them because nobody is producing them, or there's big there are no inventories, no stocks, they are all gone, so they can't buy them, or they don't go and buy anymore. Some people...
yeah, don't forget, they've built up a lot of debt before COVID, so build that in.
Yeah, but I think there are some... Okay, I had this discussion with Mario Saccareccia, so where we not totally agree, but I mean, I think we can say that there's a number of people who are just like you said, they have a large debt and they are trying to reduce it, which is the case in Canada as well. The debt to disposable income ratio in Canada has gone down by 17 points. But, so you have that, but you also have people who are better off with the COVID, either because they're getting money from these government programs. In Canada, they get $500 a week. A lot of people never earn that much. And also you have all those people who just don't go out and spend. They don't want to go in restaurants anymore. They cannot go to Europe. They cannot travel to Australia or New Zealand. And so they're remaining at home, and that's why the saving rate is so high. And that's why it's so difficult. I find it difficult to construct a model that would explain exactly what's going on during COVID-19 crisis, which in my opinion is completely different from all the standard recessions that we had in the past, which were generated by, say, the central bank by raising interest rates.
I think Mario Teixeira has raised his hand virtually, but we had also on the line Robert Blacker and Eka Time. So I'm not sure if it's a comment or a question.
Excuse me, could I, if I understood it correctly, I could speak right now on this? It's a question actually, but it's more of a suggestion as well, Mark, which is that in your model, obviously you assume the propensity to save is zero on the part of the production workers. So if you have the high income workers and the low income workers, you have this distinction. But the reality of the last, God knows now, certainly 2 decades at least, I would say, it has been that, well, as you know very well in this country, which is that the savings rates of these, at the low end there, has been negative, really, throughout. And if you were to think that the low-income ones are the production workers and the high-income one are the managers, if you wish, okay, what difference would it make? I mean, we have, for your model here, because as you know, it's not been so much a wage-led growth as it's been a credit-led growth, really, is what we've been seeing. And it's household-led, credit-led growth primarily, which is what we have seen over the last while. And I'm just wondering, in this case, if you were to put in there something, to the effect that maybe at the production worker level, or if you divided them up into 2 categories, even as you in terms of the quintiles, there's no question about it, that the on the very low ends, even the median, like actually the middle income range of the quintiles, it's negative in Canada. Okay, so that this is something that would it affect it in any way, your model?
Well, as I said earlier, the direct laborers or non-supervisory workers represent 80% of the population. So that's that's 4 quintiles. So, okay, can we say that the lowest 4 quintiles go into debt? I don't know. But I mean, whether they do or not is not important in a modeling sense, in the sense that it doesn't really matter whether we assume that there is this autonomous expenditures coming from the managers or coming from the direct workers from the point of view of the results. But from the point of view of modeling, as soon as we introduce either saving by direct workers or debt by the direct workers, then you introduce a further complication. You would need to have the debt ratio to be another. So instead of having 2 variables being, adjusting in the long run, you would need 3. So already it's much more complicated. And as I said, if you have saving by the direct workers, then you have to take into account that they are going to receive profits or dividends. Therefore, you have to take into account their wealth, their share of wealth, their share of profits. And so once again, then you would have a 4th variable. So that's the main reason why it's not in there. But I'm sure some younger guys will do it.
So now I think next on line is Robert Blacker. So if you wish, mute.
Hello, Mark. And
Hi.
I will try to be brief given that it's pretty late. So my question relates to your use of what is essentially a type of super multiplier model. And I understand the attraction of this, and you get very neat results. It's a very cool paper. I like this ability to talk about the levels instead of growth rates in the long run. I think that's something that post-Keynesian economists have not done enough in regard to. Nevertheless, I confess to some skepticism about the idea of exogenous growth, that there's some kind of autonomous, non-capacity creating demand. Yes, there surely is, but does it increase at an exogenously given rate over a long enough period for the economy to adjust to that? And is it really like a strong attractor, one might say, as Asrafian would put it? And of course, I'm sure you know the quote from Kalecki I read yesterday to the effect that the long run is nothing but a series of short run periods. It has no independent entity. So this is really a very different view where the long run is driven by an exogenous growth of demand that has an independent entity and that is pulling the economy along. So I am just curious how you see this kind of model fitting into a broadly post-Keynesian or Kaleckian approach. As I say, I'm not hostile to it, but I am skeptical about the exogeneity of it.
Yeah, well, I mentioned our former postdoc, Brett Fiebiger. He does not call it autonomous expenditures. He uses the word semi-autonomous expenditures, which was also an expression used by Kalecki himself. So Kalecki also had these semi-autonomous expenditures in mind when discussing things.
But that was for the short run. I'm asking about it as a long run, you know, something that creates a long run steady state that the economy has to adjust to.
Well, I mean, it's like in every one of our Kaleckian model, we have some parameters, the gamma in the investment function. There's this constant in the investment function. It doesn't mean that we believe that this constant is constant forever. You know, it's just there for modeling purposes. So it's the same with respect to this GZ, which represent the rate of growth of autonomous expenditures. I mean, you're quite right. We know that you know, expenditures tied to credit, construction industry, and all that is something that can vary quite a lot for whatever reason. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the nec plus ultra model. It's just one among many others, including all those that, you know, many of the people here have done in the Eckert Hein or whatever have done in the past.
Yes, I think we have 2 more minutes. Eckhard Hein, I think, had a hand raised, but maybe the question was the same as Robert Becker because I think he...
Exactly. My question.
Yeah.
So,
Eric Benedict says in the chat that he already has a COVID-19 crisis model.
Yes, that is true. So if we don't have any more questions, if you allow me to make a small clarification question, I would like to know what do you mean by the autonomous consumption of managers? Is it financed only by the savings of managers, if I understand well, because it's the saving parameter in the model, or if it's also financed by credit that managers take? If not, if so, then yeah.
I mean, implicitly, this is what is being assumed, that somehow they can spend from their accumulated wealth, or they could get credit from the banks,
yeah.
But we don't want to explicitly take that into account.
To account.
Yeah.
I think we don't have any more questions. I thank you, Marc Lavoie, for a very interesting paper presentation, and all the participants for questions and the heated debate in the chat.